Beneath the gilded arches of Renaissance Florence, where the river Arno coiled like a silken ribbon, and the clang of merchant life rose each morning with the sun, the Medici name began not as a symbol of unchallenged grandeur, but as a quiet whisper among traders who measured risk the way others measured cloth. And it was within this restless, evolving city that the Medici Bank would emerge as both an engine of immense wealth and an invisible architect of political power, threading its influence through guild halls, papal chambers, and the vibrant, dust-filled workshops where artists carved immortality from marble. For to understand the rise of the Medici Bank is to witness a story in which finance becomes a form of storytelling itself, shaping destinies through ledgers more potent than swords, and where each transaction carries a ripple that extends from the counting rooms of Via Larga to the grand cathedrals echoing with sacred chants. For this was a Florence still fragile from factional strife, craving stability yet hungry for innovation. And into this environment stepped Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici, a man whose instinct for calculating risk was matched only by his uncanny ability to sense the emotional tides of clients, allowing him to transform a simple banking operation into a mechanism of trust building that would soon draw in merchants, nobles, and even popes who recognized in Giovanni a rare blend of discretion and ambition, qualities that allowed him to weave financial relationships with the Holy See that would elevate the Medici Bank into a continental powerhouse. While behind the gleam of Florence and the murmured negotiations lay a vast network of branches stretching from Rome to Geneva, Bruges, and London, each pulsing like a financial artery that connected the beating heart of Florence to the wider European world, where caravans carried not only spices and wool, but also information that the Métisses collected, sorted, and weaponized with a mastery that made their bank as much an intelligence network as a commercial enterprise. And while the Florentine Republic prided itself on its ideals of civic liberty, the flow of money granted the Medici a shadow influence that seeped quietly into elections, into guild disputes, and into the choices of artists who were sponsored to elevate the family's prestige, creating a cycle in which money built reputation, reputation invited power, and power protected money, forming a triad that would allow Cosimo de' Medici, Giovanni's heir, to rise from banker to de facto ruler of Florence without ever needing a crown. For Cosimo understood better than anyone the silent language of obligation encoded in loans, favors, and advantageous partnerships. And he used the bank not merely to enrich himself, but to engineer alliances that stretched across Europe, cultivating relationships with monarchs who depended on Medici credit to wage wars or secure political marriages. While at home in Florence, he deployed philanthropy as a strategic art, commissioning libraries, chapels, and academies that dazzled citizens and bound them emotionally to the Medici name, with the Medici Bank financing not only SA cultural endeavors, but also the machinery of the family's political rise. Yet beneath the dazzling achievements and the polished veneers of prosperity lay fault lines, the inherent fragility of medieval finance, the volatility of international trade, the constant threat of excommunication affecting clients, and the dependence on papal favor that could shift abruptly with the election of a new pontiff. And even as the Medici perfected the system of the partnership model, where each branch was semi-autonomous, its managers incentivized with profits, but strictly monitored through detailed account books, the very complexity of this structure carried risks for mismanagement, corruption, or shifts in local markets in far-off Bruges or London could undermine the entire system, causing tremors that reverberated back to Florence, a vulnerability that would eventually haunt the family in later generations. Yet in this early, ascending chapter of the Medici saga, the bank remained a vibrant symbol of Renaissance dynamism, fueling artistic revolutions by financing figures such as Donatello and Brunelleschi, whose dome for Santa Maria del Fiore became both a masterpiece of engineering and a testament to how the Medici Bank's wealth could convert into civic glory, strengthening the family's persona as benevolent patrons rather than calculating financiers. And through this careful orchestration of image and influence, the Medici transformed the very concept of banking, elevating it from a transactional profession to a form of soft power that could rival that of kings, a power that wed Cosimo to return triumphantly from exile after his rivals miscalculated the depth of loyalty he had purchased over decades. And upon his return, he guided Florence with a subtle, almost invisible hand, allowing councils to meet and elections to proceed while ensuring through credit, patronage, and quiet pressure that outcomes aligned with the Medici vision. A governance model so refined that contemporaries remarked the city seemed both free and controlled at the same time, a paradox sustained by the bank's continuous flow of capital which funded mercenaries, stabilized grain supplies, and secured diplomatic goodwill, making the Medici indispensable to Florence's stability. And yet, even as wealth piled high in the family coffers, the seeds of hubris were beginning to form. For a bank that expands too rapidly becomes vulnerable to distant markets, unreliable partners, or political upheaval beyond domestic influence. And the Medici would later discover that financial empires can collapse as quietly as they rise. However, in this phase of ascent, with the Renaissance blooming around them and Europe awakening to new possibilities of science, art, and commerce, the Medici Bank stood at the center, like an unseen conductor directing an orchestra of nations, guilds, and artists, shaping history not through battles or decrees, but through the subtle power of credit, trust, and information, weaving a golden thread through the fabric of Florence that would glitter for generations, even as its true strength depended on the careful balancing of risk and ambition, a balance that Giovanni had mastered and Cosimo elevated into an art form, but which would eventually test the limits of a family that believed its fortune could withstand any storm. For beneath the grandeur and the confidence, there were already murmurs among distant branches of delayed payments, strained relationships, and markets shifting in ways that even the meticulous Medici intelligence network could not fully anticipate. And as Florence entered a period of heightened political tension, with rival families seeking to reclaim influence and foreign powers eyeing the city's strategic position, the Medici Bank found itself both a fortress and a pressure point. Its successes binding the family to an ever-growing web of obligations and expectations that required constant attention. And while the brilliance of Renaissance Florence illuminated the streets with festivals, processions, and artistic triumphs, the quiet rooms of the Medici counting houses held their own form of drama, where clerks bent over ledgers, tracked the lifeblood of Europe, and where a single miscalculation could trigger ripples felt from the Vatican to the wool markets of Flanders, creating a tension between prosperity and peril that simmered beneath the surface as Cosimo sought to secure the bank's legacy for his son Piero, whose fragile health and different temperament raised questions among advisors about whether the next generation could maintain the delicate machinery Giovanni and Cosimo had engineered, especially as the bank faced emerging challenges that would test the family's unity and expose vulnerabilities hidden beneath decades of triumph, leaving Florence to wonder whether the Medici's rise was the beginning of an unbroken dynasty or merely the bright crest of a wave already beginning to curl into the first hint of a gathering storm that would eventually test whether their power, so carefully constructed through networks of debt and loyalty, could withstand the mounting pressures of a world in which even the wealthiest bank could be undone by forces beyond its control, forces that would soon begin to whisper through the halls of Medici palaces and counting houses alike, as the next chapter of their story unfolded with the weight of decisions, alliances, and risks that would determine whether the Medici Bank's brilliance would expand into new heights, or whether the foundations that had sustained it would start to tremble beneath the strain of shifting fortunes that were already beginning to rise or fracture under the accumulating pressures of a world that was changing faster than any ledger could capture. For as Piero de' Medici assumed stewardship of the bank he inherited, not the calm, well-oiled machine his father had once commanded, but a structure already strained by diverging interests across its far-flung branches, and Piero, often called the Gaudi, struggled physically and temperamentally to assert the same quiet authority that Giovanni and Cosimo had wielded with such grace, creating spaces of hesitation where rivals sensed opportunity. And while the Medici name still carried immense weight across Europe, the shifting winds of commerce, especially the decline of the wool trade in key northern markets, forced the bank to tighten its operations, just as extravagant spending at home rose to maintain the family's image, a contradiction that gnawed at the institution's stability, especially when key branches such as Bruges began to suffer from poor management, fraud, and an unfavorable political climate that stifled English and Flemish trade, causing losses that spread like a slow-moving crack along the bank's financial spine. And Piero, already hampered by illness, found himself trapped between the demands of Florence's political life and the urgent need to discipline or restructure branches abroad. A task made even more complicated by the fact that the Medici's greatest clients, like the papacy, were themselves vulnerable to scandals, wars, and rapid changes in leadership. Each new pope bringing with him a different set of allies and financial expectations, creating a precarious dependency that turned every conclave into a moment of existential suspense for the bank. And yet amid these mounting challenges, the Medici attempted to preserve their aura of prosperity, investing in lavish displays and maintaining the patronage networks that had long sustained their political supremacy. For Lorenzo de' Medici, Piero's son and the future Magnificent, grew into a charismatic figure whose artistic vision, poetic temperament, and diplomatic brilliance would come to define a new chapter of the family's story. But even he, with all his gifts, could not entirely ignore the groaning infrastructure of the bank beneath the glitter of Florentine culture. For Lorenzo inherited a world in which political alliances had become more volatile, with powerful states like France, Naples, and the Papal States maneuvering restlessly across the Italian peninsula, threatening to turn Florence into a pawn unless the Medici could leverage both wealth and diplomacy with extraordinary finesse. And Lorenzo, though exceptionally skilled, often found himself compelled to use the bank's funds not for profit but for political survival, extending credit to allies, appeasing rivals, or financing peace through costly gestures that chipped away at the bank's reserves. While at the same time, artistic commissions from Botticelli's mythic visions to the young Michelangelo shaping marble in the Medici gardens demanded continued investment to uphold Florence as the radiant cultural capital of Italy, a radiance that masked the increasingly precarious reality of the Medici financial empire, whose branches in Lyon, Bruges, and London suffered from a mixture of mismanagement, changing markets, and strategic errors that compounded slowly until they could no longer be ignored. And as losses accumulated, Lorenzo's political enemies sensed weakness, culminating in the infamous Pazzi conspiracy, where rival families, backed by external forces, attempted to assassinate Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano during High Mass in the cathedral itself, a shocking act that spilled blood at the very heart of Florence, galvanizing the city around Lorenzo, but also accelerating the conflation of Medici identity with the survival of the Republic, binding Florence's fate even more tightly to the head of a bank that was quietly collapsing beneath the surface. For after the Pazzi affair, the Pope excommunicated Lorenzo and placed Florence under interdict, forcing the Medici into a hazardous diplomatic balancing act that drained still more resources. And although Lorenzo ultimately restored Florence's international standing, the bank itself continued to deteriorate, with major branches closing or being absorbed, their books revealing deficits too deep to conceal. While at home, the growing burden of maintaining political dominance strained even the Medici's famed networks of loyalty. And by the time Lorenzo's health began to fail, the once astonishing Medici Bank, whose reach had once spanned from the Vatican to the markets of London, was little more than a shadow of its former grandeur. Its collapse slow, quiet, and almost sorrowful, as though the institution itself understood that its time had passed. For financial empires, no matter how sophisticated, cannot survive indefinitely when they become instruments of politics rather than engines of commerce. And yet the legacy of the Medici endured beyond the life of the bank, for even after its financial machinery fell apart, the cultural, political, and intellectual foundations the family had laid continued to shape Florence, Italy, and indeed all of Europe, influencing not only the patrons and princes who followed, but the very idea of how wealth can be transformed into power, and how power, when wielded through art, diplomacy, and persuasion rather than brute force, can reshape the destiny of a city. Which is why the Medici story remains one of the Renaissance's great paradoxes. A banking dynasty that collapsed precisely when its political and cultural zenith was achieved, as though history itself were reminding us that prosperity built on delicate balances must eventually yield to the pressures of change. And in the Medici's case, those pressures arrived through war, shifting markets, and the natural limits of even the most extraordinary leadership. For Lorenzo's death marked not only the fading of Florence's golden age, but also the conclusion of the Medici Bank's long, intricate journey, a journey in which ambition, risk, and vision intertwined to create an empire that dazzled the world before ultimately dissolving into memory, leaving behind a tapestry of lessons about the fragility of financial systems, the cost of political glory, and the enduring power of cultural legacy to remind us that even the greatest banks rise and fall, but the stories they etch into history can outlast every ledger they ever kept, continuing to echo softly through the corridors of time, long after the final account has been closed.